Today, there are 3 Sega consoles that unfortunately tend to be overlooked and eclipsed by some of Nintendo's consoles that ran alongside these at the time. I want to remember those 3 Sega consoles today. We're going to be taking a look at the Sega Master System, the Sega Game Gear, as well as the Sega Dreamcast. Here in the West, the Sega Master System released in 1986 and was a direct competitor to the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Master System here in the United Kingdom released around £99, which by today's standards is approximately £300, so the console weighed in at a hefty price back then. A year before this, in Japan, the Sega Mark III was released, which essentially was the Sega Master System, and unfortunately it got off to a bad start. It was classed as a commercial failure by many against, again, the NES, or by Japan standards, the Famicom.
Sega Master System, the challenge will always be there.
Now we know Sega had high hopes for the Sega Master System sales by the end of 1986, but comparatively the NES sold over 10 times more than what the Sega Master System did. Is it a commercial failure? Is it a cultural failure? What do we think about it in 2020? Today, the Sega Master System is remembered for not being as well remembered, especially back in the United States, where the console really didn't take off at all. And again, even by today, it tends to be a very obscure console to collect for, to come across, and to purchase any particular games or peripherals for. And again, we have to look to Nintendo because it was the NES back in the 80s that completely dominated the console market. Atari couldn't compete, and clearly the Sega Master System was struggling in numbers. I know a lot of my American viewers really love the Sega Master System, and if you're in North America, what's the Sega Master System market out like there? Do you see many games? Do you not? Let me know in the comment section below, because I can assure you here, you don't see that much Master System around, and when you do, it tends to be the more expensive games, and that's absolutely fine, but I don't think there's as big as a market out here now. I even feel that there's not many people talking about the Master System on YouTube, like I said in the intro. There's not huge collectors out there. In fact, I can only think of one person I've ever met that said, I'm going for a full Sega Master System collection on games, peripherals and consoles. It used to be a chap that I knew up north. He had a retro game shop that had closed now in Shildon, but he actually had a really good Sega Master System collection. It's very hard to collect for because, again, it just wasn't that popular. The Sega Game Gear released in 1991 and was Sega's first attempt at penetrating the handheld market. Sega had already had a foothold in the gaming market with the Sega Master System released in the 80s. Pressure was already on, however, to do well because of the wildly popular competition, namely that with the Nintendo Game Boy. Now, we all know the Sega Game Gear was no true match to the Nintendo Game Boy in terms of sales, games and popularity, but come on guys, credit where credit is due. The Sega Game Gear made its mark with a backlit colour screen and some great titles like Sonic and Columns to propel the system's lifespan. And speaking of lifespan, the Sega Game Gear amassed over 300 officially released games, and fans were able to enjoy belters like Space Harrier, Mickey Mouse, Sonic and many, many more. Now let us not forget the additional peripherals that really ramped up the lifespan of the Sega Game Gear, particularly with the TV tuner, which was something that you attached onto the top of the unit, which enabled you to watch television on your Sega Game Gear. I know for me back then that was a major pull and attraction of this beautiful handheld, and unfortunately it's one that tends to get overlooked in its credibility in 2020. Now, much later into the Sega Game Gear's life cycle, there were some awesome releases of the consoles, most notably that with the Coca-Cola release, which was originally released. In fact, it was an exclusive in Japan only. If you can get one now, it will set you back a pretty penny. But for all of its attractions, there came some fails in the big time, because the capacitors were one of the major failing points, leading to a drop, if not a complete loss in picture quality as well as audio quality, which is unfortunately what's happened to my unit as it stands. Whilst the Sega Game Gear wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing handheld on the gaming market, there's no denying its power, but unfortunately, holding up against the Nintendo Game Boy proved very difficult for Sega in the handheld market, and the Sega Game Gear did not get as much love as it truly deserved. Had it have not been for the Sega Mega Drive, I've often wondered what would Sega's place and history have been back in the day. Of course, we had the mighty Sega Saturn, which did release before the PS1, and then the PS1 came out, and it just seemed like the Sega Saturn was completely forgotten, which burns my soul, because the Sega Saturn had some fantastic titles and really shone for me with its arcade style races like Sega Rally. But unfortunately, well, not necessarily unfortunately, but fortunately and unfortunately, the PS1 came in and just dominated the 32-bit period. But I just want to give a massive honourable mention to the Sega Saturn. 9/9/1999 was the launch date for the critically acclaimed Sega Dreamcast. This console is over 20 years old, and even by today is one of the powerhouses of the retro gaming consoles ever made. The Sega Dreamcast was home to phenomenal games such as House of the Dead 2, Shenmue, Crazy Taxi, Sonic Adventure, Jet Set Radio, and had the introduction of the awesome fighter Soul Calibur. And for its time, the Sega Dreamcast was one of the most revolutionary products on the market, being able to play the likes of Phantasy Star Online. So why did the Sega Dreamcast not do so well back at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the noughties? Well, it's clear that Sony had a larger portion of the gaming market, what with the PlayStation 1 and the pending release of the PlayStation 2. The Sega Dreamcast was never really going to experience its fruitful lifespan, and I don't think that Sega gave it the marketing campaign that it truly deserved, and in my opinion, it died. It had a very short lifespan and it died very quickly, but luckily by today's standards we do have a lot of Dreamcast enthusiasts out there like myself that are still popping their original copy of Shenmue into the system and enjoying it right back like it was 1999 again. Now, in my opinion, Sega didn't give the marketing love that it should have done to those three consoles. Again, that may have contributed to why they weren't as popular, but there's no denying the might of Nintendo. And with the likes of the Game Boy versus the Game Gear, the Game Boy just had more love. It had more love in its marketing campaign. Most people had the Game Boy in schools. There tended to be more word of mouth around my social circles, and I think that was again because Nintendo really pushed it and were very clever with its marketing. Is it a shame? You let me know in the comment section below. So there we go, a little bit of history. Let's remember those three amazing Sega consoles. Please share some of your Sega memories and I'll retweet anybody that shares this video to Twitter using the hashtag Team24. So just chuck it in there. If you're kind enough, guys, click that first link in the description for me to become a sponsor of the channel. Really helps me to upgrade my equipment to continue to do this. Hopefully it can become more of a full-time thing as we go forward. But for now, subscribe. It's free. My name is Gemma. Take care. See you soon.